Hello and welcome to this webinar on the 2027 World Anti-Doping Code and International Standards Update Process, also referred to as the 2027 Code and IS Update Process. My name is Jonathan Jenkins. I am a Senior Manager in WADA's Compliance, Rules, and Standards Impact Area, and I am the responsible coordinator for this 2027 Code and IS Update Process. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a concise overview and summary of the 2027 Code and IS update process, and in particular, the different phases leading up to the 6th World Conference on Doping in Sport, which will take place in Busan, Republic of Korea in November 2025. Following a short introduction, this presentation shall specifically address certain elements as it relates to the 2027 Code and IS update process, including the drafting teams, timelines, key phases, and next steps. When the first World Anti-Doping Code was approved at the Second World Conference on Doping in Sport in Copenhagen, Denmark in January 2003, WADA committed to ensuring that the code would be a living document subject to periodic review. Accordingly, subsequent reviews have occurred and culminated in revised versions of the code and international standards in 2009, 2015, and most recently in 2021. The 2027 Code and IS update process follows this original commitment to periodically reinforce, strengthen, and update the code and international standards. This noted, feedback received by WADA from stakeholders is that the code and international standards are effective and do not require whole-scale review, hence the intention to update and fine-tune these documents to ensure their continued effectiveness for use and implementation. The 2027 Code and IS update process is a key strategic project, and the Compliance, Rules, and Standards Impact Area is responsible for its coordination. As will be shortly discussed, specific drafting teams have been designated for the code and international standards. As it concerns the 2027 Code and IS update process, it is important for stakeholders to also consider that certain international standards will not require the same degree of analysis or change as others. For example, the International Standard for Code Compliance by Signatories has recently undergone a consultation process, and an updated version will come into force in 2024. Consequently, it is expected that this international standard will not require the same breadth of review and update at this time. However, stakeholders will nevertheless be offered the opportunity to provide their general feedback on this international standard should they have any. Conversely, stakeholders should also note that a standalone international standard for intelligence and investigations shall be added, and the current international standard for testing and investigations shall revert to a standard dedicated solely to testing requirements. This change reflects the increased importance of investigations and intelligence in the global anti-doping system. Drafting teams are at the core of the 2027 Code and IS update process and have been specifically tasked with reviewing and considering feedback from WADA stakeholders and subsequently providing expert advice and recommendations, as well as drafting proposed amendments to an updated version of the code and international standards. To better facilitate their work, provide clarity on their key responsibilities, and in keeping with governance best practices, each code and international standard drafting team has been established as a formal working group in accordance with WADA's governance framework and regulations. The principal objectives and key responsibilities of these drafting teams and their members are housed in specific terms of reference, and this information can be found on the WADA website under the Governance Working Group section. Drafting teams are composed of both internal members from WADA management and external experts from various signatories and organizations. The members have been specifically appointed on the basis of their relevant experience and knowledge in anti-doping, and in particular, their areas of specific expertise. As previously mentioned, for further information on the composition of the different drafting teams, as well as the exact terms of their terms of reference, I invite you to visit the Governance Working Groups section on the WADA website. As with previous review processes, the 2027 Code and IS update process shall follow the same general principles to ensure that stakeholders are widely consulted and receive sufficient time to provide their input on any proposed amendments to the code and international standards. In this respect, the 2027 Code and IS update process has been specifically structured to offer stakeholders the opportunity to provide feedback and for drafting teams to address specific aspects or concerns in the code or international standards before final versions are approved by WADA's Foundation Board and Executive Committee in November 2025. As represented in this timeline, the 2027 Code and IS update process is composed of 6 distinct phases. The first phase, also known as the stakeholder engagement phase, will run from September to December 2023. This will be followed by a first drafting phase, which will run from January to April 2024. Following the end of the first drafting phase, there will be a stakeholder consultation phase, which will occur between May and October 2024, before a second drafting phase takes place between October 2024 and January 2025. This will be followed by optional consultation and drafting phases before the final phase, a finalization phase, which will take place between May and November 2025. The first phase, as mentioned, which we are launching with this webinar, is the stakeholder engagement phase, and this will take place from September to December 2023. During this phase, stakeholders are invited to provide comments and feedback on certain key concepts which have been collated by WADA management and drafting teams, and which have been identified as requiring consideration for review or update. These concepts have been collated into different concept papers, which can now be accessed through the WADA Connect platform, where stakeholders are also invited to leave their comments and feedback. As in previous review processes, stakeholders will also be given the opportunity to offer feedback and comments on other areas outside of these concepts, which they consider require review or updating based on their own practical experience and application. Otherwise stated, your input is equally important in ensuring that the code and international standards continue to be fit for purpose. The second phase, also known as the first drafting phase, will run from January to April 2024 and shall consist of drafting teams considering, reviewing, and implementing stakeholder feedback into the code and international standards, which will have been received during the first stakeholder engagement phase. Following the end of the first drafting phase, stakeholders will then be invited to provide their input on the first amended drafts of the code and international standards during the third phase, the stakeholder consultation phase. This phase will occur from May to October 2024, and it specifically takes into account the 2024 Paris Olympic and Paralympic Games. In other words, this consultation period shall occur over an extended period of time when compared to consultation periods in previous review processes. Similar to the first drafting phase, the fourth phase, the second drafting phase, shall consist of drafting teams considering, reviewing, and implementing stakeholder comments and feedback received during the preceding stakeholder consultation phase. Following the conclusion of this second drafting phase, and depending on the breadth, type, and importance of comments or feedback received, the different drafting teams may further decide that one or more abbreviated consultation and drafting phases on specific or limited aspects is required. Following any such abbreviated and optional consultation and drafting phases, final versions of the code and international standards will be prepared and submitted for formal approval by WADA's Foundation Board and Executive Committee before their presentation to the 6th World Conference on Doping in Sport to be held in Busan, Republic of Korea in November 2025. Considering the 2027 Code and IS update process has been officially launched, stakeholders are now invited to share their feedback through the WADA Connect platform on the key concepts which have been collated into separate concept papers by WADA management and drafting teams. If you do not have a WADA Connect account, I invite you to create one by clicking on the Create Account link at the top of the WADA Connect webpage. If you have any questions on how to navigate WADA Connect, you may also click on the FAQ link, which will direct you to the WADA Connect user guide. Please note that Friday, December 22nd, 2023 is the general deadline to provide feedback on the key concepts and to offer any additional thoughts or feedback on the code and 7 of the 8 international standards as part of this first stakeholder engagement phase. Please also note that there is an exceptional deadline of November 15th, 2023, which has been set for the International Standard for Education. Thank you for watching this webinar on the 2027 Code and IS update process. We very much look forward to receiving your valued input and feedback over the course of the next 2 years. If you have any questions relating to the 2027 Code and IS update process, I invite you to send an email to code@wada-ama.org. If you have any questions relating to the substantive work of the code or international standards drafting teams, please visit the working group's webpage on the WADA website where you will find the relevant contact information.